use a reactive AI in our methodology to actually pick the right countermeasure which blocks the technique that the attacker is using in that moment in time.
Welcome, everyone, to the Industrial Security Podcast. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm here with Andrew Ginter, the Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions, who's going to introduce the subject and the guest of our show today. Andrew, how's it going?
I'm very well, thank you, Nate. Our guest today is Gary Southwell. He is the General Manager and Vice President at Aria Cyber Solutions, and we're going to be talking about AI, a new use for AI in protecting critical infrastructure.
Then, without further ado, here's your conversation with Gary Southwell.
Hello, Gary, and thank you for joining us. Before we get started, can I ask you to, say a few words about yourself for our listeners, and say a few words about the good work that you're doing at Aria Cybersecurity.
A little bit about me. So my background, I've been in cybersecurity really since the early days. I was a system engineer in the 90s, working on some of the initial checkpoint deployments as firewalls. Spent a lot of time at Ginter Networks trying to improve the way we did network security with more of a intrusion detection prevention systems. Moved on into a company called Sekion, where we worked on adding artificial intelligence to a SIM product so that we could do more advanced managed detection response solutions for MSSPs. And really over the last 7 years, I've been here at Aria Cybersecurity, and we've really looked at how do we actually stop the attacks that we're seeing in the news. And if you date back, the attacks we're talking about are the ones that are really going after the critical assets that are out there, everything from the colonial pipeline on. We want to make sure that we've got a better way to actually go in, utilizing artificial intelligence properly to find and stop these types of attacks.
Thanks for that. And our topic today is using AI to protect critical infrastructure. And my understanding of the way, that you folks use AI is in the hosts. I mean, outfits like Juniper and others have used AI in their firewalls for a long time to look at the messages coming through and try and figure out, are these things attacks? You're doing something different, is my understanding. You're not focused on the firewalls, you're focused on the hosts. So, we already have, in a sense, antivirus on the hosts. We have whitelisting on the hosts. What is the problem you guys are trying to solve, and why isn't it already solved with antivirus and whitelisting?
We believe you want to actually stop the attacks at the point where they're actually attacking the critical applications, which is what drives your critical infrastructure. So the challenge with solutions, we call these active solutions if they're going on the host, is that if you look at traditional antivirus that's been around with us for 20 years, is that they are looking for files typically that land on the device and they have a known bad signature. That's calculated off of looking at the file. You can calculate a hash and it comes up with a value. If it matches something bad that I've been told about, I can block it from running. It's a great concept. The problem is malware of all kinds, including ransomware. The signatures are now polymorphic really over the last 5 years. So you get a different value every time it lands on a different device. That approach really isn't effective anymore as we've entered this decade. The other approach, as you mentioned, is whitelisting. It kind of got a bad name because it's been difficult to use, but whitelisting just means, or we call it access control these days, is it says I can delineate which application should be running on this device. I can check their certs and then make sure that it is that application and then allow it to run. And by default, I'll block everything else. So these are good approaches if we could make them work in today's environments. So we start there. We were saying we need to make sure that the critical applications can run, and anything else that would land, like a file-based malware, ransomware, would not run. That's just your very basics. The challenge is with these zero-day attacks, as I said before, is that they can't detect them with signatures. So the industry kind of evolved over the last 5 years to looking at patterns of behavior, or what we really call as the industry indicators of compromise. When something bad lands on a device, it does this, and then this, and then this through the kill chain. We can identify the pattern. Once we know the pattern, if we have a way to then block one of those steps, we can disable the attack. We call that next generation antivirus. So vendors like CrowdStrike, SentinelOne do a really good job with those types of approaches. However, when we get into what are the rest of the attacks, these are more sophisticated level attacks, like the ones we've seen in the industry, starting with SolarWinds, where you've actually got humans behind the attacks. They may use some form of credential use or deposit software through a legit channel like they did with SolarWinds. And then they progress an attack once they get a foothold, and they begin to take additional steps. So we've got a myriad of attacks. So bringing this back to how do we use AI, we want an approach that can actually detect the various attack techniques that are happening. And if they are somehow adulterating an application, trying to deposit a new one on the device, or you're coming in and using existing processes against themselves. We used to call those advanced persistent threats. They're more generic. Very specific ones are like living off the land, where they're using the actual OS processes against the actual device. We need to be able to detect that and apply the right measure to stop that type of attack. And this is what we believe is the role of AI on the device. It's not your generative AI. Just make sure you understand that it typically needs massive horsepower. This is the opposite. We use a reactive AI in our methodology to actually pick the right countermeasure, which blocks the technique that the attacker is using in that moment in time.
Andrew, I would just like to second a lot of the points that Gary has made here. It feels like we might have crossed some sort of vague threshold in recent years where traditional detection antivirus has started to work a little bit less. I mean, as he mentioned, the number of variants and samples out there of your typical malware can get really crazy. I mean, only in recent months, I recall a report about mobile malware. I think this was published by, I forget the vendor, where you wouldn't think of mobile malware as necessarily quite as subject to security analysis as traditional PC malware. And yet, so many malware families that target mobile devices these days have hundreds or thousands of samples out there. There's a malware called Godfather with well over 1,000, Nexus, Siderit, Pixpirate. So those kinds of solutions that would have picked up based on traditional fingerprints may not suffice anymore, even in the mobile realm, let alone PCs where we would expect it. And there's also the fact of, he highlighted briefly there, behavioral indicators of compromise. This to me seems like where cybersecurity across IT and OT has been going lately. Traditional indicators of compromise can help, but I recently came across a report from Mandiant about Chinese ORB, they call them, networks. ORB being short for Operational Relay Box Networks. It's not an entirely new concept, but basically, in China, there's an entire economy of folks who provide infrastructure to threat actors across the Chinese spectrum. And so where once we might have been able to say, look out for these servers, they've been used by this group. Well, now those same servers are being used by all kinds of groups. And so it's less helpful now. So the way that we are adapting is by tracking behaviors of threat actors rather than static indicators like that. So this is a very long way to say that I agree with all of the points that Gary has made.
Yeah, and you're talking about polymorphic. These are viruses that change frequently. Either the bad guys change them frequently, so there's thousands of variants out there, or they change themselves. They sort of self-evolve. So again, there's thousands of variants out there, so that signature-based solutions have a hard time keeping track, publishing enough signatures fast enough to track things as they change. The traditional sort of
alternative to signature-based antivirus in the industrial space has been whitelisting or application control, some people call it, or allow listing. What it is a list of programs that's allowed to run on your industrial computer, and blocks everything else. So it doesn't matter what the latest signature of the virus is. If it isn't allowed, if it's not on the list of allowed, then it's blocked. But that class of solution, allow listing, is itself limited. So, for example, when you install software updates, you have to update the list of allowed applications because you've just changed a whole bunch of your applications. You've changed their signatures, you've changed their sizes and their, So having changed all that, that's a vulnerability. If the bad guys can get in there and hack the update process, they can get their nasty listed as an allowed executable, and they're off to the races. Other ways that allow listing is limited. Everything is limited. I'm not knocking allow listing. It's a useful solution, but bear in mind that it tends to focus entirely on executable code. So DLLs, .exes, .coms coming off the hard drive into memory, and that's when they apply their checks. If your malware is scripted, well, I'm sorry, the Perl.exe is allowed because the operating system needs it, or the control system needs it. Python.exe might be allowed, and now you're loading a nasty as text off the drive, and allow listing is kind of blind to that. They don't really check text files. And another class of application that are of bad stuff that allow listing is blind to is in-memory attacks. So if you can compromise something and start executing with a buffer overflow or something, and start executing your own code and insert the malware into memory, again, allow listing looks at things coming off the disk. It doesn't look at what's happening in memory. So we need, as malware becomes more sophisticated, we need more sophisticated tools to diagnose it and deal with it. And, here's a new kind of tool. And these are some examples of why we are always looking for sort of the next step in these tools.
There is something new in the world. Waterfall's Hera Gateway is hardware-enforced remote access for OT networks. What does hardware-enforced access mean? It means that even if both internet-facing CPUs in the Hera device are completely compromised by a zero-day or a stolen credential, even if they are compromised, the attacker still cannot pivot their attacks through the hardware into the OT network. Hera's hardware saves us. This is true interactive remote access with hardware-based protection from cyber attacks. For details, please visit waterfall-security.com/Hera, that's HERA, Hera, or visit the Waterfall Security Contact Us page and request a briefing with an expert on Hera, hardware-enforced remote access.
You talked about sort of attacks that can defeat the access control as well. Can you go into a little more detail? We're going to talk about AI in a second, but can we nail down what is sort of a modern advanced piece of malware? What's it look like? And can you sort of, not comprehensive, not every kind of malware that come after us. Can you give us sort of one example of the kind of thing that existing antivirus and access control might struggle with?
Let me pick one example to let the audience get their heads around the use of advanced malware and what do I mean by a sophisticated level of attack. So one comes to mind. I mentioned it a minute ago. And this was the type of attack that really set the industry kind of on its ear. So I'll date myself back to January 2021. This is when the discovery of the SolarWinds attack was happening. Now, this was a nation-state-backed attack. And if I step into it a minute, it was very, very clever the way they did it. It was called a sunburst attack. It used malware. But the way they decided to get in was to actually go into SolarWinds infrastructure. And as they were packaging their Orion software for an update, they actually put in what we call a shim form of malware inside that update. Very, very small. So that would go through and not be easily detected. You didn't want to like be doubling the size of the update. That might get picked off. So it was very, very thin. And its sole objective was to get in, and as the Orion software update was initiated, it would be ready to do its one task. And its one task was to call back out of the location back to a command and control location where the rest of the attack had happened. Okay. So this is very, very small piece of malware. Actually, being embedded as one of the tool sets inside of the Orion update was clever. But they also made it what we call polymorphic. So as it deposited inside there, it slightly modified itself so that if you were to calculate a signature, it would be slightly different for each form of deposit. This makes it a lot harder for us to go and say we can pick it off. And because it's now embedded in a tool set, that makes it very difficult, because most of today's more sophisticated solutions weren't looking at that level, trying to figure out what was happening. And it only really exhibited one behavior. It did a callback. What happened next, though, was after the callback, the attack actually had 12 more steps. And the callback brought in another form of malware. And that was more what I would call the business end of the attack. So that had more capabilities inside of it to launch and step up the attack, to allow it to figure out what was on. And then its other role was then to attempt to spread inside the environment if it could, and then pull back information. And that's when humans would get involved and then would begin to take additional steps. So that's an example of polymorphic malware enabling the beginning of a sophisticated attack that would get by most of the protections we have today as an industry. So the next part of the attack, as it began to evolve, had multiple steps. And one of the steps that was in the attack, and this was brought up in the Senate hearings, where they brought in some of the industry leaders, Palo Alto and CrowdStrike, of course, Microsoft and SolarWinds were in the panel, and they said to them, and they all agreed, it's like, in some of the situations, you were present on these devices when this attack was occurring. I'm trying to quote Marco Rubio because he asked the question, it was reported that you were bypassed. And everyone in the panel said, yes, that was in fact the case. So bypass just means that, in effect, they either couldn't see the attack, or more likely, the attackers were actually able to have control of the system and basically disable them at the taskmaster location, at least temporarily. They probably come back right up and boot up, but it then lets them get by if they're doing something else that they might see an attack. So these were fundamentally new sets of challenges that the industry now had to face, that you could use basic tools like malware, but in the hands of sophisticated actors, they could do an awful lot of harm. And as we saw with SolarWinds, it went on for almost a year without actually being detected. It was fortunate enough that FireEye actually saw some of their tools actually leaving their environment, and that was the first time that was ever picked up. Since then, we've had a series of similar, I think the OT industry itself, from last count, had about 700 of these types of attacks actually happening. Not all from the same actor, by the way, but other actors. Because once the formula was figured out, sophisticated attackers could then utilize some of these same techniques. So this has been, the ones right after were the Colonial Pipeline. That was a simplified variant of what we just heard about. But there's other types of attacks that have gone over the years.
Can we talk about AI? This is the topic here. If we had a magic AI sitting in our industrial control system hosts, what would that AI do? How would it detect attacks like this?
Well, that's the part that's the most challenging, and that's why you need some form of AI. There are very different techniques that are being applied, by the attack type. Some cases it's just recognizing that there's foreign code that's appeared here. In other cases, it's like, I've got to understand that there's an abnormal operation happening in conjunction with this legitimate application. There's some form I will call adulteration going on here. In other cases, it's the application is running fine, but for some reason, it's going from a user level trying to escalate itself to a system level that allows them to get control of the application. Or it's trying to use processes inside the OS that are not affiliated with an application, or it's a spoofed application variant that's actually trying to initiate the processes on the OS. Some of these, I'll bring that up, is that came out in the pool party attacks at the last Black Hat in the UK. They showed 8 different forms of thread processes that are available from the OS for the applications to use that attackers could easily take advantage of. So I've really described 3 different types of techniques, and inside there's a variety of combinations. So this makes it very difficult to figure out how to stop all forms of attack. If I want to make sure that we're doing the best job we can at the host to stop whatever may be happening, whether it's a 0-day form of malware or ransomware that we haven't seen before, we haven't seen the IOC patterns and it's trying to just do its thing, or it's one of these variations of attacks that these sophisticated, typically nation state backed, but now it's cybercrime backed attacks that are out there, that these kits are out there and they can vary their attacks. So the AI really needs to make sure it's saying, I can pick off what's happening, and then what do I do about it? Just like a human would. I've identified it's a sophisticated attack. Someone's using a privilege escalation. I'm going to apply this countermeasure to block it. I've discovered this is an interesting piece of code that's arrived here, and I need to block it. I recognize that this application is no longer working the way it should. It's actually copying things off into buffer spaces that it normally doesn't do. I need to stop that from happening and block that operation. Or I've got unattached processes from the OS that should not be running. I need to make sure I can block them at this moment in time. So this is where the AI comes into play from our experience here in the industry.
Okay, so let's get specific here. We've been talking about the problem sort of in the abstract, and we're drifting into, you folks have this stuff. Can you give us just a quick rundown? What do you have? How does it work? Why do people deploy it? What are we talking about here?
So in our particular application of this technology is we built a very lightweight agent, and it's different from your typical agents. We are going in at if you understand kernels, especially in the Windows environment or Linux environment where we play, is we attach at ring 0 right at the kernel level. The reason we do that is we want to see everything that's going on as far as processes from applications that are leveraging what's happening into the kernel and vice versa. The other thing that we do that makes us fairly unique, we actually have some patents on this, so we're hoping it'll stay unique, is that we actually watch device memory continuously. This is the way that we can actually pick off some of these techniques when you've got abnormal use of buffer memory, or you're actually seeing some process kicking off where something's being written over here into Notepad, and that's now being imported into the application because it's probably giving them access to some form of change to the application that they want to leverage. We do that inside our agent. The markets that we've chosen to go after, though, have a variety of requirements. We're typically talking about operational technology environments, and there's many of them. If you think about manufacturing, we're talking about manufacturing floors. When you think about utilities, we're in the process devices out there that have an OS on them that are helping them run and control the electrical generation and distribution. You're talking about oil and gas, same way you're dealing with the processes. So these are environments we chose to go after because they are high value targets, as we saw with the Colonial Pipeline is a good example. When we get into these environments, we also find that you have got other constraints. Typically, there's not continuous internet connectivity. In fact, they purposely tried to limit that as one of the protections. They often have limited processing power available left to anything else that's going to run besides the production applications. In some cases, some of these devices are old, or they're running what I would call old versions of the OS because they've been trying to sweat that asset for many, many years. For example, we're deployed in a large pharmaceutical around the world. In different locations, we'll have devices that are in these various lines, and you'll see, I see Windows Server 2008 over here. In some locations, we actually see Windows XP. Typically, it's Service Pack 2, which is nice because it's got nice controls. And they're still using that asset because they built their applications on top of that, and everything just runs. And in typical OT fashion, if it works, don't change it. And then their hope was, let's wall off the environment using passive protections from the networks if we can. And yet what they found is supply chain attacks get around the network protections. So what we did is made sure that our application could run on these older operating systems. It could run with very, very limited amounts of CPU and limited amounts of memory so that we could perform and not impact the performance of the production applications. The benefit of this approach is that we can go on to a myriad of these devices with many, many different forms of applications. And I'll go one step further here is when we're deploying in these environments, we expect to see tens of applications. In fact, in some cases, we actually see upwards of 1,000 of these applications. So our approach as we deploy is to prevent the adulteration of applications. One of the side benefits is in these environments is that when you have this many applications, you're going to have known vulnerabilities inside those applications published by CVEs. And the chance of ever having them all continuously patched, even in an IT environment, is almost nil. And when you only have a chance to patch maybe once a quarter at the fastest, and more likely in this pharmaceutical company, it's once a year, you're never going to be patched. So one of the side benefits was because we go in and protect these applications from adulteration, the ability to exploit these vulnerabilities becomes significantly less. I won't say zero, but we can go down to a 99% chance that we are going to block the exploit of these applications. And this then becomes a real benefit because now you've dramatically improved the likelihood that we can keep these operations operational even during an attack because we will continuously block those attackers. So that's the benefit. When people went through the risk analysis, they're saying, okay, I can look at it. The cost of my line, if it goes down for X number of hours, is thousands of dollars. And if it goes down for a month, it's millions of dollars. And if you've taken down my risk by a factor of 99%, I can actually calculate a value to that. So these are the benefits that we're offering. Now, the challenge really then is you've got all these applications. How do we actually make it easy for these operators to use this technology?
So there was a lot of stuff there, Nate. Let me come back to the SolarWinds example. Gary said the malware came in as part of the SolarWinds security update, so that would have defeated the whitelisting, the application control I was talking about, because it would have come in saying, hey, here's a new authorized executable, and the malware would have been flagged as authorized. And then what the malware was something that phoned home, that called out to the internet and said, hey, boss, I got a live one here, and did not much else. It was very thin. It was small. It was benign looking. A lot of malware phones home to the vendor, not just malware, a lot of legit software phones home to the vendor and says, here's what's going on because the vendor is helping manage the software. So it's not that suspicious, that the malware is phoning out to the internet. The alarming thing is that what it got on the internet was, here's another whole bunch of code, and it copied the code that it got from the internet into memory and started executing it. And at that point, it became dangerous. It really started doing nasty stuff. And so, again, whitelisting would have missed it as part of the software update, would have missed it as in memory, pulling stuff off the internet or off the socket, the connection out to the internet, and inserting it into memory and starting to execute it. This is where we need, sort of a deeper insight into execution. So that, I think that one example sort of hit all the marks there.
You're doing things that antivirus and access control don't. Can I ask, just a clarifying question? When your stuff is deployed, do you tend to see it deployed in addition to antivirus or whitelisting access control, or are you deployed sort of instead of that?
We've seen it both ways. We designed it so it would run in parallel, with some of these AV solutions that are out there. Because again, we're trying to go in there and say, we're not disrupting your existing infrastructure. If you have a reason to keep running that, great. We'll just come in and run alongside. We've never gone in and they've kept an application whitelisting solution there. They've typically just moved to us. So in many cases, they'll be running things like Windows Defender, and we're running in addition to that.
Your stuff is installed in the kernel. In my experience, there's long-standing reluctance to deploy any kind of security technology on existing hosts in existing OT network, existing systems. The vendors sometimes push back and say, no, you've installed somebody else's software on my system. I don't support this anymore. You're on your own. There's vendor support agreements. There's legal agreements. It gets complicated. Can you talk about that? How has this technology been received in an environment that just doesn't want to change anything?
Well, that's an excellent point that you're making, and it is one of the inhibitors we see, but it is changing. The industrial automation vendors, typically which you speak, are recognizing that there's problems here, and they can either be part of the solution or they can be held liable as part of the problem, and you're seeing a movement there. For instance, we have just gone public with a relationship with Rockwell. And they're bringing us now in as part of their solution to solve these types of problems where appropriate. And we're having these discussions with these other vendors. In some cases, they are very, very regimented, and others are much more open to provide more modern approaches, if you will, to stopping these threats, because they are happening and they're starting to happen in increasing fashion. So they can't just tell the customer, my legal agreement with you says you can't run protection that I haven't approved on your system, and then find out that their system was compromised because their applications had vulnerabilities in them that were exploited. So you can see the challenge is there, right? So these vendors are now starting to move. And it is something that really has just really happened over the last couple of years.
You were talking about bad stuff, shims that download other bad stuff. The shim looks benign, but it winds up downloading code and executing code that's not so benign. Just thinking about it, this is what happens in browsers. Browsers download JavaScript routinely. They execute the code routinely. If your AI forbids downloaded code, does it break the browser? How do you work with browsers?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. So, when we get into OT environments, you don't typically see these types of behaviors happening. So they're not downloading apps through browsers and dynamically executing code. So that's not your typical behavior that you're going to see. We do have certain countermeasures, though, to allow us to deal with things like malicious JavaScripts running and picking off those types of techniques, because that may be running independent of your typical browser download. So we do stop that.
There's a lot of applications in an IT environment, and to a lot of people's surprise, there's a lot of applications in an industrial control system environment as well. You might imagine that, there's fewer control systems in the world than IT networks, but there's still a huge diversity of applications, of software, of even hardware out there. Is it possible for you guys to learn all of those applications and keep track of them as vendors release new security updates? Do you do this sort of centrally? How do you manage that diversity?
Yeah, there are multiple ways to do this. And we do try to work with the large industrial automation vendors in advance to get as many of these as we can. But we realized early on that we couldn't depend on that. So we built our application so that once our agent became active on the device, it would quickly inventory everything it found running on the host. And then would slowly also look at everything that was over on the disk. Again, the word slowly is there because we're trying to make sure we stay within operational parameters so we don't slow down the device at all. So when we do that, we can inventory everything. In some cases, we'll say we find 100 applications. We'll build that list on the device. And each of our individual agents on all devices will build a list. Now, to make it easy on the operator, we can come up in a mode we call prevent mode, where we say, okay, we're going to assume that all the applications we just built are good. All right. Chances are that probably the situation. And then we have these additional countermeasures that are going to watch and see if anything else happens which is not good. One of these attack techniques. And then those will then trigger us to stop those techniques and zero it in on the application so that can be explored. So this allows the vendors to deploy our agents out on the devices and just say, okay, you come up and prevent. You allow everything that's running to run. You turn on your countermeasures to look for bad techniques. And then what they do is they communicate to a centralized application that's running inside this customer site, typically. And it could be right down on these manufacturing lands in some cases. We're running an air-gapped environment, factory floors as we speak, so they don't have normal connectivity to the outside world. But the 100 devices in a manufacturing floor communicate everything that they've learned on their devices, and it builds the central manifest. And then now you've got, it'll depopulate itself if you like, but now you've actually got an inventory of every single application on which devices or which lines, because it'll actually give you that capability to name the lines. And we found that of extreme use to a lot of these manufacturers, because a lot of times they don't know all the applications or the application variants that are running there on each of their OS platforms. So it gives them visibility of that. And then they can say, okay, this is I can now have an approved level of manifest. And if something goes wrong, I can look through that and take out those bad applications. Or I can say, you know what, I'm looking through this list and I really don't like that Notepad is running on these applications because that's something that could be used by an attacker. So I'm going to say I want to block that. So the centralized control system, or we call our trust center, can then send an update out and say, block the use of Notepad. So it's a way for you to control the policies in which you allow certain applications to run. So this was well received because I said we have this large, global manufacturer, and they were like, this is good because the people on the sites trying to run these things don't have time to go figure everything out. They need something that's simple. But then when we're looking and doing some periodic reviews, we can sit there and say, okay, we can examine what we have here. We can decide what we don't like running. And we also can get an indication of all the different variants of these various applications so that we can do better planning going forward. In the meantime, they're fully protected from these types of attacks that they're most concerned with. Everything from the zero-day ransomware and malware all the way up to these very sophisticated nation-state-backed attacks. They're typically coming in through their supply chain, by the way.
So that struck me as interesting, Nate. a lot of people have been on the show talking about asset inventory. You can only protect what you know you have. But asset inventory in most implementations, in my understanding, tends to focus on what kind of devices are there. There's PLCs, there's RTUs, there's protective relays. There's Windows machines, there's Linux machines. What what OS are they running? What version of the OS are they running? What patch level are they running? What software has been installed? Has the software been patched? What these folks are doing is sort of coming at it, I assume, all of that, and they're going through and making a long list of all of the executables that are installed on the machine, which is sort of the next level of detail. I mean, he mentioned the example of Notepad. Notepad, there's nothing in the list of installed software that says Notepad's installed. It installs when you install the OS. It's not a separate install. So having that sort of more detailed asset inventory is, to me, is interesting. It strikes me as potentially useful in terms of additional hardening that you can apply to these machines.
I'm not sure that this was the point of what you just said there, but you mentioned Notepad and he mentioned Notepad. I'm wondering, why is Notepad coming into any of this? That's just the application that I never use on my computer.
Yeah, it's an application I never use either. It's an application that lets you edit text files. And, if you have a README file, nobody wants to edit it. They want to read it. You can read it in lots of things. The browser will let you read it. Notepad lets you create text files as well. And apparently attackers, it's one of the tools that attackers tend to use more than regular users, because the attackers always need to put some script file down so you can execute it, or put a stolen license key into a text file so it can be imported, and so on. So I guess this is again one of the tools that owners and operators might look at and say, I never use that. We don't need that. The only people that are going to use that are the bad guys. Take it off the machine. We had an episode, I think, recently talking about living off the land. We touched on it briefly, the using tools that are part of the operating system to launch attacks. This sounds like one of those tools. Never really occurred to me, but yeah, when you say it, I never use Notepad either. So if it's only the bad guys doing it, that's a candidate to take off the machine.
You were talking about the ability to run in sort of an advisory mode versus an enforcing mode. Is this relevant to, let's call it, upset conditions? I mean, how often do you start the plant from scratch? Maybe once a year? And everything behaves a little bit differently during startup. How often do you do an emergency shutdown? Hopefully no more than every few years. And in an emergency shutdown, everything is different. Everything is changing. Do you make sort of provision, make exceptions in those cases?
Prevent mode is our normal mode. But when we go into these, let's call them updates, usually it's maintenance windows, emergency shutdowns, we just ask that the operators turn us into detect mode. That way the product keeps running, but as they make these changes, we're not going to try to get in the way of things happening, especially like you say, when there's an emergency going on, or you're just getting a batch of updates coming in, from patches to new revisions of applications coming in across the board. Then once things settle down, you can look at what we detected as showing alerts, or not. It depends on what they want to do. It depends on the situation, of course. And then if you see everything is fine from what we reported, you just accept all those changes. You can say, these are okay to run as is. I basically start fresh and move back into prevent mode. So all the changes have been accepted and we run from there. So that's the way that we deal with that. And we find it works out pretty well because it's just simple toggling of a switch and then toggling it back on once everything is stabilized. And you still have an ability to track everything that happened during that mode where you were doing all those changes. So we have all these wonderful operational logs that tell you about exactly what happened. So in a lot of these environments that are definitely under a lot of scrutiny, compliance reasons, they now have a complete history of what's happened.
Well, this has been great, Gary. Thank you for joining us. Before I let you go, can I ask you to sum up for us? What should we be thinking about when we're thinking about this space?
Well, as I started off, you've got to make sure you've got a solution that has an ability to stop all these different variations of attack. It doesn't help if you're only covering 20% of the attacks out there. You've got to cover the full level of attacks in order to have a solution with efficacy. The other point I think we want to briefly touch on is that you can have the best solutions out there, but if they're not easy to actually implement and deploy and update, then the solution will not be successful. That's got to be that simple, that operators with minimal training can figure out how to deploy it, make it come up, and then deal with this as they go through their normal operations as they run it, or are going through a period when they've got a maintenance window running and they're making updates to all their applications in their environment. I would say there's a call to action going on right here, because for so long, the industry has tried to stick with the old ways. In the old ways in the OT world, where they try to use passive defenses as much as possible, air gap, which means there's no internet connectivity, as much as possible, and yet the attacks keep coming. The problem is there's the human element. The industrial automation vendors, I don't want to pick on them, but they have to update their applications at some point. So either they're bringing in people, or they've got third parties that are coming in, or the customer has third parties coming in. And that's when we have people walking past the network and then plugging into these devices, often with USB sticks or maintenance laptops, and the updates happen, and so do the problems. So you can't be myopic and think we can get away with approaches that worked in the last decade when there's actually ways that defeat them every day in our environments. So I would say the takeaway is, if you're going to look at a solution, you've got to find one that will work, will drastically reduce your risk, that's easy to deploy, and then can deal with these situations where traditional defenses just don't cover the problem.
So, Andrew, to close out here, Gary's talking a lot about choosing the right solutions, which solution is a tricky word, right? Are we really solving something here, or are we iterating on a long history of what we've been doing prior?
That's a good question. I would use the word innovating rather than iterating. The bad guys keep getting better at what they're doing. They keep inventing new and different and subtler ways of attacking us. And so our defenses need to become more capable, as time goes by, as well as the threat environment changes. And here's an innovation. Here's a way to address a kind of attack that is becoming more widely used by the sophisticated, the high end of the attack spectrum. Putting something benign looking into a software update, putting something benign looking on a machine, and then loading the nasty in memory into that benign looking thing. This is the world we live in. This is starting to happen reasonably regularly. We need technology that's going to address this threat. The bad guys innovates. We need to as well.
Well, thank you to Gary Southwell for speaking with you, Andrew. And Andrew, as always, thank you for speaking with me.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you, Nate.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thank you to everybody out there listening.